Welcome back to In Business. Mexico today plans to sell as much as $2 billion of peso-denominated bonds. Now, this is the country's first local debt offering through a syndicate of banks. And here to tell us more about Mexican bonds, plans for currency reserves, much more ahead, and why international investors should be looking at Mexico is Mexican Deputy Finance Minister Alejandro Werner. Thank you so much for joining us in studio today. Let's start with the news of the day. We just talked about this bond offering today. What has demand been like? What are you anticipating? What are you seeing?
Yeah, exactly. As you were mentioning, this is the first time that we go for a syndicated bond offering for the 10-year peso bond. We're seeing pretty strong demand for the placement. We were aiming, as you mentioned, for 20 billion pesos, and from the information we've gotten in the last few days, there's a significant demand, and we hope this is going to be a successful first syndicated process that we're planning to repeat on other bonds throughout the year. On the peso index bonds and on the 3, 5, and 30-year bonds throughout the year and into 2011.
Now, March is what we had been hearing for that 30-year you just mentioned. That would be an inflation-linked bond.
Exactly.
It's coming to market next month?
A peso index, CPI index bond is going to come to the market in March through a syndicated placement similar to the one that we just did, and we will be announcing the results of today's placement later on in the afternoon.
So those will be issued the same way as today's bond offering?
Exactly, with the advantage vis-a-vis what we were doing before, that basically we are creating a significant supply and liquidity for the new issuance that with the previous procedure would have taken us between 4 and 6 months to build up the liquidity that now we are providing as soon as the bond is on the market.
Now, the idea here is to help attract foreign investment, right? Bring some of those foreign dollars to Mexico. A part of making that more commercial would also be inclusion in the World Government Bond Index at Citi. Do you anticipate inclusion in that?
I mean, Citi placed us for inclusion in the bond a while ago, and they have been monitor our domestic markets for its final inclusion. We obviously think that this is a measure that will help make our domestic bonds more liquid, make our market more efficient, and therefore contribute to the inclusion of Mexican domestic government debt into the WGB index.
How do you plan to make Mexico more competitive? I mean, what's sort of the long-term pitch to an investor looking to put money to work in Mexico right now?
Yeah, you're right. I think the challenge for Mexico is more on the real side, on the growth side, the employment generation side, than on the financial and the fiscal side, where we have been successful in the last decade. But as you mentioned, I mean, growth in Mexico has been below what has been in other countries, and the pitch there is basically to work on structural reforms, work on our infrastructure agenda, work on reforming our energy company, work on opening up the telecommunication sectors, those sectors where competition
from the
has
U.S.?
been. Well, I mean, there's a natural relationship between Mexico and the U.S., but basically providing the elements of domestic demand, domestic competitiveness in key sectors such as energy, telecommunications, that will provide a domestic source of aggregate demand growth that will make Mexico a little bit less dependent on growth in the U.S., especially for the next few years in which the U.S. consumer that traditionally has been buying our exports will be a little bit more subdued than before the crisis.
Now, there is concern within Mexico, as you well know, when you pick up the newspapers and you see the coverage of your country in the United States or around the world. There's so much attention paid to the issue of security and what's happening with the drug cartels. Headline risk always matters when people are putting money to work in a market. Tell me, how do you offset those concerns?
I think basically this is the first time in many years in which the government has faced these cartels head-on, and obviously that has generated a lot of news, a lot of coverage. However, when you look at the hard data, the homicide rate in Mexico at around 12 homicides per 100,000 people is below the main countries in Latin America, maybe below Mexico. You find Chile Uruguay, but the rest of the country, and Argentina, and the rest of the countries are above Mexico. So in that sense, when you look at the hard data, you see two things. That first of all, Mexico is not one of the most violent countries in the region. I would say it's in the middle of the region towards the lower end. And secondly, I think important advances have been made in seizing arms, stopping drugs going to the U.S. and being delivered in Mexico, seizing money, and putting people in jail. So in that sense, I think the strategy has been having some important successes. And at the end of the day, this is what we need to do to make, in the medium term, the country safer and society more equal and less violent.
All right. Good luck with that. Thank you so much for joining us here on In Business.